Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us virtually with Bosler Memorial Library for this talk on the Grotesque 10 with Mr. Mathew Duman. He is a photographer, graphic designer, and author, and has presented this unique selection of amazing architectural sculptures from 10 American colleges and universities. And you can learn more about him by going to his website that we will provide in the description above this video. And we will start by showing an introduction for this presentation.
Years ago, Mathew Duman embarked on a grotesque safari, trekking thousands of miles to 10 American institutions of higher education in search of their most fascinating architectural sculpture. At last he returned with hundreds of images, revealing the grotesque secrets of the Grotesque 10, amazing architectural sculpture from 10 American colleges and universities. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Grotesque 10. My name is Mathew Duman, and you might be wondering why I'm dressed like this. Well, that's because I'm going to take you on a grotesque safari to a place where you can observe the behavior of gargoyles and grotesques in their natural habitat. In other words, the American college campus. So let's get started. Many years ago, I noticed this sculpture at Yale University. It not only sparked my interest in the grotesques and gargoyles at Yale, but led me to explore other universities in search of interesting sculpture. Now you may be thinking, what's so interesting about this one, and what does it even mean? Well, it is a bit confusing, but I'll keep you in suspense until the end of my lecture as to the meaning. So keep this image in your head. Next slide. 10. It's a nice round number, isn't it? In this case, it refers to the number of institutions of higher education that I've visited. Many of these schools are quite well known, but I did not choose them for their reputation or academic prowess. I chose them because each is a collection of artwork on their campus that I find very interesting. And I'm not talking about items in their museums or archives, but sculpture on many of their academic buildings themselves. Each has examples of a building style called Collegiate Gothic architecture, a characteristic style which is a revival of the Gothic architectural style of medieval Europe, yet was actually constructed in America in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Like their medieval cousins, many of these buildings are decorated with fascinating sculpture, which are referred to architecturally as grotesques. Next slide. Therefore, my book is called The Grotesque 10. It features amazing architectural sculpture from 10 American colleges and universities. This sculpture can be particularly interesting because while it is meant to look ancient, it can possess modern concepts and themes. Now, what schools make up this Grotesque 10? Well, I'm glad you asked. Next slide. There are a variety. Some were founded in the 19th century, and even a few from the 18th, but all possess some form of architectural sculpture on their campus buildings. The 10 schools featured in my book are, next slide, Bryn College in Pennsylvania, next slide, Duke University in North Carolina, next slide, Northwestern University in Illinois, next slide, Princeton University in New Jersey, next slide, Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, the City College of New York in New York City, Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, the University of Chicago in Illinois, the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and because I keep finding new sculpture there even after years of exploring, Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. Now, Gothic architecture came out of medieval Europe, but even back then it was not new to decorate buildings with sculptural flourishes. But in medieval times, it was common to apply sculpture to churches and cathedrals to scare away evil spirits, or on a more practical level, to graphically demonstrate lessons of morality from the church, because much of the parish population at the time were illiterate. Next slide. Universities at this time were closely associated with the church. Often academic life was centered around a cathedral, so the architecture of the church greatly influenced that of university buildings. And this carried through to modern times. Now, when we look at these buildings, are we to believe multiple groups of architects, masons, glaziers, and other artisans came to North America during the medieval period and set about constructing Gothic building projects in far-flung places on a wild and unexplored continent? Well, if you believe this, then contact me after the lecture. I've got some lucrative investment opportunities for you. So in other words, no, of course not. Examples like this are obviously much younger than those of medieval Europe. Next slide. The Collegiate Gothic trend became popular in the mid-19th century and remained so through the 1930s, and is still in use today. Rockefeller Hall was built at Bryn, Mawr in 1904. Next slide. And Bass Tower was constructed at Yale University in 2017. So why did college architects look backward for inspiration when designing campus buildings? Not surprisingly, a big reason was financial. Even the oldest colleges in North America are new compared to the old world institutions of Europe. American colleges also lack the cultural status that those of Europe had, and 150 years ago, our universities were not looked upon with the nostalgia and respect that they are today. Reviving venerable building traditions like Gothic was a great way to create an unspoken connection with the long-established universities of Europe. This connection elevates the status and prestige of American colleges in society, and in turn, their endowments and donations as well. Next slide. There are a variety of historic styles. Many of these and other campuses have buildings that were built in other architectural styles, such as the Georgian style from 18th century England, or the classical style from ancient Greece. Honestly, most campuses have become a mixture of many different styles, so why choose to revive Gothic for your college campus? Well, by the mid-19th century, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Though there were many positive technical advancements due to industrialization, many came to see mass production as a threat to individuality and individual craftsmanship. Gothic was seen to celebrate the individual, an individual expression. Think of the distinction between something that's handmade versus something that's mass-produced. Also, in a practical sense, Gothic encourages asymmetry, like on this building at Duke University. This plan better fit the variety of uses collegiate buildings have to accommodate, such as athletic facilities, lecture halls, laboratories, dormitories, etc. Different functions that require different types of space. And most importantly for our examination, Gothic architecture is seen as timeless. Generally, Gothic-style buildings look old, no matter what the actual age of a building is. Next slide. I know it's a cliche, but it can be said that universities are like a fine wine. Wines improve with age, and schools are seen in the same fashion. This concept was not lost on architects. While you can't change the actual age of a building, you can change the perceived age of it, or how old it looks to be. In fact, these architects use many subtle, and some would say sneaky, techniques to enhance the age of their buildings. Next slide. At Duke University, you can find some staircases which are worn from so many years of footsteps that the tread of the steps is grooved. These stairs have actually been molded with the groove in them from the beginning. These steps are meant to show the wear of many hundreds of years of footsteps on a staircase that is not yet 100 years old. These were built in 1938. Next slide. Another aging technique involves the roofs of these buildings. Many Collegiate Gothic buildings have slate rock shingling in their roofs. Next slide. Look closely and you'll see many imperfections in the shingles, chips, cracks in the slate, and rough, uneven surfaces, speaking of hundreds of years of exposure to the elements. As in the case of the stairs, many of these roofs were intentionally created this way, with chips and discolorations purposefully added. Next slide. Other aging techniques involve the building of the walls themselves. Random window frames may have no glass and look to have been blocked up years after construction. These features are intended to give the building the look of sporadic renovations over hundreds of years, when in fact the building was originally constructed with many of these features from the start, like this false arched window at Yale University. See how the blocks in the window area exactly match those of the surrounding wall? Next slide. And look at this blocked up window at the City College of New York. Note the presence of the iron bars to enhance the illusion that this was once a real window. But think about it. Why would they leave the iron bars there after sealing the window? What practical purpose do they serve now? What criminal would try to break into a window that is now as solid as the wall around it? Next slide. One decorative feature commonly seen in these buildings is the architectural niche. They are a tall, thin alcove, usually featuring a decorative canopy at the top and a flat platform at the base. They look like the perfect place for a statue, and some do contain just that. But more often than not, they're empty. These were intentionally left empty. You are supposed to assume that all of these spaces were originally filled with dignified sculpture. But throughout the building's quote-unquote long and colorful history, most of these statues were stolen, destroyed, or just plain removed, when in actuality, most of these niches were empty from the beginning. Next slide. And lastly, never underestimate the aging effect of a good garnish of ivy. Mendel Hall at the University of Chicago dates from 1903, but looks positively ancient when encased in ivy. These aging techniques are meant to work on passersby at an almost subliminal level, unconsciously leading you to draw the conclusion that these buildings are generally pretty darn old. You don't know how old, but definitely much older than any man-made structure nearby. Next slide. This brings us to my favorite feature of Gothic buildings, grotesques. Putting sculpted decoration on collegiate Gothic buildings is a direct extension of the Gothic traditions of European architecture. Many early collegiate Gothic buildings have grotesques featuring medieval imagery, such as this king from the University of Chicago, another way to strengthen the connection between the institutions of the new and the old worlds. In architectural terms, a grotesque is a sculpted decoration on or in a building, and usually is representative of a human, animal, or fanciful creature whose form may be exaggerated to the point of caricature. Next slide. A gargoyle is one type of grotesque. This is the specific kind which is used to channel rainwater off of the roof and away from the building, so as to protect the masonry from erosion. So basically, it's a decorative rainspout, hence the modern verb to gargle. Next slide. I've already demonstrated how these buildings can mislead you, and the world of grotesques is no exception. This sculpture from the University of Chicago looks like a gargoyle, but look closely. It does not have a pipe or a channel to drain water. I call these false gargoyles. While they are intended to look like gargoyles, they are just regular grotesques. Now, to make it easier to understand, I've divided grotesques into categories based on their subject matter. When I began establishing categories for grotesques, I originally referred to them as different species to show that, like animals, grotesques can come in a wide variety of types, until I found there was a fatal flaw in this analogy. Next slide. By definition, two animals of different species cannot produce offspring, no matter what the sci-fi channel may tell you. Next slide. So you'll never see a sharktopus. Next slide. Or a werewolf. By the way, these images are not in my book. But different breeds of animal reproduce all the time, like mixed breed dogs or cats. I find these types of grotesques to be a fascinating mix of meanings. Often you need to look at them many times in order to interpret the different messages contained within, because they may combine the characteristics of multiple breeds. The basic breed of grotesques is the historic variety. They portray something about the history of their building, its area of study, the school, town, state, or even country. At the back of Yale's Sterling Memorial Library, two reliefs depict similar occurrences but set 212 years apart. Yale was founded in 1701 in Branford, Connecticut. The school built a college house in New Haven in 1718. One relief depicts the transport of Yale's books via ox cart to the new building in New Haven. Next slide. The other portrays the unloading of books from other Yale libraries to the newly built Sterling Memorial Library in 1930, and they're loading it from a gasoline-powered truck. Demonstrative grotesque simply depict some aspect of their purpose of their building. Howe's chapel is part of the Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary on the campus of Northwestern in Illinois. The finial on its roof depicts two hands clasped together in prayer, a preview of the activity commonly found inside the chapel. Next slide. The demonstrative grotesque seems a pretty straightforward concept, but things can get confusing as time moves on and buildings change their function. Rosenwald Hall at the University of Chicago serves as the admissions building, but began life as home to the Department of Geology. This explains the relief portraying a saddlebag, rock hammers, fossils of sea life with the slogan, "Dig and Discover" below it. Next slide. Collegiate Gothic buildings can also have the breed of grotesque that convey their meaning through allegory and symbols, as on the front of Northwestern University's Deering Library, where allegorical grotesques teach time-honored lessons, like a winged hourglass for time flies. Next slide. Or a tortoise that crawls slowly past a sleeping hare, recalling Aesop's fable and proclaiming haste makes waste. Next slide. An important breed of grotesque is those of the school spirit variety. They usually consist of a representation of the school's mascot or another symbol relating to the institution's identity. Trinity's mascot is the bantam, a particularly stubborn and scrappy rooster. Its likenesses can be found flanking the archway at the Downs Memorial Clock Tower. Next slide. This gentleman is not the City College of New York's mascot, but he is displaying the school seal. Because the dude, excuse me. Next slide. Handsome Dan the Bulldog is Yale's mascot. He can be found many places on Yale's campus, like looking out from his doghouse at Pauli Murray Residence College. And judging by the state of his bowl, I think he wants to be fed. Next slide. One of my favorite breeds is the facetious grotesque, or the funny ones. Now, I have to say, when writing this book, I intentionally left this breed for last, assuming they would be the easiest one to write about because I find it the most enjoyable. However, when it came time to write this section, I quickly realized the huge distinction between telling a joke and explaining a joke. In my first attempt, I was trying to explain these grotesques, dissecting their message and at the same time stripping out all of the humor. Therefore, I let this breed of grotesques speak for themselves, such as this less than illiterate demon on Princeton University's Dillon Gymnasium. Next slide. Or a drunken patriot on the University of Pennsylvania's Residence Quadrangle. Now that I look at it, this might have a little of the historic variety of grotesque in it, if this is supposed to represent a drunken Ben Franklin. Next slide. Another personal favorite of mine are those grotesques that are just plain bizarre. The facetious grotesques are attractive because they make us laugh and feel good. But what makes these bizarre grotesques so attractive? Well, here's my theory. From childhood, we humans are taught to believe that every question has an answer and every puzzle a solution. When we come upon puzzles such as these grotesques, they become inherently interesting to us because we get preoccupied with finding their meaning, even when there may be no meaning to find, such as this baby ape in short pants on Washington University's McMillan Hall. Next slide. And I just don't know what to say about this one at the University of Pennsylvania's Residence Quadrangle. The spikes are there so the birds don't land on the cornice, but I don't know what they were thinking when they sculpted this one. Next slide. The final breed of grotesque is one that, by its very nature, gets little attention, and that's the reclusive breed. It's a type of architectural Easter egg and sneaks by most people. They could be as simple as abstract animals hiding in the decoration, such as these abstracted tigers' heads. The tiger is Princeton's mascot, hiding in the decor of Jones Hall. Next slide. Or at Trinity, where you can find a rabbit and a monk carved underfoot into the flagstones of the floor of the cloisters at the chapel. Now that you know the general types of grotesques, Let's have a look at a few from each school of the Grotesque 10. Next slide. Penn's expansive resonant quadrangle is known by some as the quad Tannic. Now, when I first heard this, I thought it was obvious. It's a sprawling, ornately decorated dormitory complex covering almost 3 city blocks, and the west end of the quad comes to a point like the prow of a ship. But I was wrong. It was really given the nickname the quad Tannic by its maintenance staff, and that's because the basement always floods when it rains. Next slide. One of my personal favorites at Penn is this guy at the quad. He's also on the cover of my book. This head is over 4 feet tall and mounted on the wall of a tunnel. These metal bars are supports that hold the light directly in front of the sculpture. I would imagine that encountering the sculpture under harsh light late at night would be pretty unsettling. Next slide. On another building, the Evans Museum and Dental Institute, there are many grotesques on its walls, and some are a reminder of a time before painless dentistry. Next slide. These statues are part of a series of 4 on the gates of the Penn Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. They were sculpted by Alexander Calder, not the artist who made the abstract mobiles from pieces of metal, rather his father, Alexander Sterling Calder, who had a more realistic style. This series is symbolic of the 4 corners of the earth from which the museum draws its artifacts. Pictured here, on the left, is North America. On the left is Africa, and on the right, North America. Next slide. Many grotesques line the entrance arches at Deering Library at Northwestern. Some are allegorical grotesques, illustrating Aesop's fables. Also note the empty niches between the arches. Next slide. One fable represented is called The Old and the Young Rat. According to this fable, a cunning old rat, shown on the left, finds a trap baited with delicious cheese. He kindly offers it to a naive young rat, shown at the right. The young rat is killed when he springs the trap while trying to retrieve the cheese, leaving it available for the old rat to enjoy. Moral: do not blindly accept gifts. Oh, note the books under the trap suggesting this fable is set in Deering Library itself. Next slide. Another fable called The Old Woman and the Jug. An elderly woman who really loves wine finds a wine jug by the side of the road. To her disappointment, it's empty, but it still contains the delightful fragrance of wine that it once held. While the moral is listed as the memory of a good deed lives on, I think a woman who is sniffing empty containers she finds on the roadside may have deeper issues. Next slide. These grotesques do not represent fables. Deering Library was designed as a place for serious study, shown at the left, but a browsing room was included so students could read for amusement as well, implied by the jester's outfit on the right. Next slide. Duke's West Campus is a beautiful example of collegiate Gothic architecture. The Philadelphia architecture firm of Horace Trumbauer designed this section of campus during the 1930s. The firm's lead designer, Julian Abele, who actually designed most of these buildings, was African American. He worked from Philadelphia and never traveled to Duke's campus to see his creations because he was opposed to the Jim Crow laws that were still in effect in North Carolina at the time. Next slide. The cigarette in this laughing grotesque mouth is not part of the sculpture, but that is how I found it. Because the Duke family built much of its fortune from the tobacco trade, I thought it was appropriate, so I left it in. Next slide. On the rear of Duke's original medical school building, you can find this horrified student. I like to think this is a first-year medical student observing his first cadaver dissection. Next slide. A vestibule in the residence quadrangles has a series of allegorical grotesques that convey an important overall message. That of hear no evil, next slide. See no evil, next slide. Speak no evil, next slide. And think no evil. Taken individually, they are merely classical heads sporting vague hand gestures. But these enhance the meaning of one another by being located so close, and together imply a theme: the 4 ways to avoid the many temptations inherent in college life. Next slide. East Pine Hall, constructed in 1897, was among the first of Princeton University's Collegiate Gothic buildings. To show how serious the school was about the style of their buildings, Princeton's campus planners had to threaten to fire the architect William Potter when he wanted to build it in a different style. Next slide. 1879 Hall has lots of mischievous monkeys. These are not demonstrative grotesques, as there are never any actual monkeys here. These are allegorical grotesques, depicting students as under-evolved primates, annoying a professor who is portrayed as human. This shows that Princeton professors had themselves evolved from rambunctious students. Next slide. Princeton's graduate college has these joyriding sweethearts, roaring down the road in their newfangled motor car. A goose and a pig leap to get out of the way of their tires. They were called the modern youth in a New York Times article from 1927 because both were smoking. Their cigarettes have long since broken off, but the New York Times headline remains, that of "Girl Gargoyle Smokes." And how about these ghoulish grotesques? The decapitation on the next slide. And how about these ghoulish grotesques? The decapitation on the right and the tongue twister on the left on Jolene Dormitory live up to what you'd expect of the word grotesques. Next slide. This image shows Brookings Hall Tower from the cloisters at Ridgely Hall. Brookings Hall is the school's administration building, but has some surprisingly bizarre grotesques, like this one. Next slide. It's called The Dragon and His Unfortunate Victim. Next slide. This grotesque is located over the entrance to the Anne Olid Women's Building and is of the school spirit breed. You can see the school motto in the center, which translates from Latin to strength through truth. But, next slide. If you stand at the front door just below it and look up, you can see the underside of this grotesque and see that it hides a reclusive one, a beskirted yet mustachioed monster. Next slide. Like many European Gothic cathedrals, Washington University's Graham Chapel has religious carvings on the inside, but these are balanced by many bizarre grotesques depicting the alternative to heaven on the outside. Next slide. This image shows Northam Towers, part of a series of buildings at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, called the Long Walk, as seen from the chapel cloisters. The Long Walk buildings were the first to be constructed on this site in 1878 and only a small part of the original plan. Next slide. One of these, Seabury Hall, has this two-headed grotesque by an entrance. It portrays male and female graduates commemorating 25 years of coeducation at Trinity. The college began admitting women in 1969, so this grotesque dates from 1994. Some Trinity College buildings were built with blank spots for later carving. Next slide. You can see other blanks in the towers of the chapel. Sadly, the Great Depression caught up with the Trinity as it was completing construction on the chapel. There was not enough money to complete the entire plan, so some grotesque ornament was scrapped in favor of more practical aspects of the design. Next slide. However, inside the chapel is a different story. There are many sculpted pew ends inside, and all the elements of these carvings are important in conveying their identity. This pew end finial might have looked like the small figure of a woodsman, but thanks to the sense of scale provided by the trees surrounding him, he is quickly identified as the enormous figure of Paul Bunyan. Next slide. Another commemorates the chapel's primary donor, William Mather, whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower. It portrays a group of William's forebears kneeling in prayer, thanking God for their safe journey to the New World. And you can see the Mayflower at anchor in the background. But what's in the middle ground? You can see in the inset, a settler armed with a rifle chases a Native American on the left. This is based on a pun that William once told, in which he joked that his ancestors were the sort who, immediately after coming ashore, they fell upon their knees in prayer. Then they fell upon the Aborigines. Mather lived in a less than PC time. Next slide. The University of Chicago's first campus architect, Henry Ives Cobb, gifted this gate to the school. He always had limitations imposed on him by the university trustees when designing campus buildings. However, since he used his own money for the gate, he was generous with the grotesque ornament. Next slide. By including these creatures ascending the roof. Next slide. Here's one interpretation as to their meaning. When you first come to the University of Chicago as a student, first you have to get by the admissions officer, shown at the lower left. Then, as you ascend the ranks of the school, you're a freshman, sophomore, junior, and then a senior at the very top. Next slide. Originally home to the Department of Geology, Rosenwald Hall has two depictions of the moon, each with a human character representing its age. One version on the right, the moon is shown with a child. Like the child, the moon is young and therefore has a smooth surface. This is contrasted by an older moon represented with an elderly man. His moon is older, so its surface has a heavy accumulation of craters. Next slide. The International Building provides housing for international students. One relief depicts the flow of people from different cultures from the old world to the new by a steamship. And on the left side of the arch is a primitive man holding a club, and on the right, a modern, educated scholar holding a book. Next slide. The City College of New York was founded as a social experiment in 1847. The school was totally funded by taxpayers, so tuition was free and admission was based solely on academic merit. For this reason, the school was originally nicknamed the Harvard of the Proletariat. However, based on buildings like Shepherd Hall, the school was recently given a more modern nickname, that of Hogwarts in Manhattan. Next slide. And if this is Hogwarts, this must be Dumbledore, on a bad day. Next slide. Elsewhere, an ornithologist measures a bird skeleton, and a geologist ponders crystals. Next slide. At the top of one of Shepherd Hall's towers, an astronomer has caught a falling star. Note the telescope in his left hand. These original buildings were constructed in the early 1900s. Notice these grotesques seem in very good condition for being exposed for more than 100 years. Well, the secret is, the grotesques on the City College of New York's buildings are not the originals. Next slide. Here are some of the originals. They consisted of terracotta covered in a thick, glossy glaze. From the beginning, no one liked the glossy finish, so all the grotesques were sandblasted to a matte finish. Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, the sandblasting created thousands of mini cracks, which allowed moisture to seep in and begin to destroy the grotesques by expanding the cracks through repeated freezing and thawing. By the 1970s, these grotesques were falling apart. Starting in the 1980s, all of the sculpture was taken down. Durable replacements were cast and put up. The originals were put into storage, and in the early 2000s, some were placed next to the school's architecture building. So near a parking area next to Spitzer Hall is a graveyard of some of the City College of New York's original grotesques. Next slide. Bryn Mawr is a women's college founded in 1888 and determined to be a direct competitor to men's colleges. Important among the methods to achieve this goal is the construction of a Gothic campus. Pembroke Hall is held in high esteem as one of the finest collegiate Gothic structures in the country. Next slide. This relief is a reference to Pembroke College at Oxford, which was named for William Herbert, the third Earl of Pembroke. Note the shield at the center with the three lions, the Herbert family crest, and at the bottom the French phrase and Herbert family motto, which translates to, "I will serve only one." Next slide. The cloisters of the old library are encircled with many creatures, such as these two with leathery, bat-like wings. Next slide. The owl is Bryn Mawr's mascot, and many versions of it can be seen at Rockefeller Hall. Here, one owl interrupts another's reading. Next slide. Were these owls attending class? I guess I was interrupting an important lesson when I took this photo. Next slide. Yale University is an example of an historic university that has developed in conjunction with the surrounding city of New Haven, Connecticut. A few years after its founding in 1701, Yale moved to New Haven. This means from 1718 on, the school and city grew simultaneously. After 300 years, Yale's campus has become enmeshed in the fabric of New Haven, so Yale uses architectural styles like Collegiate Gothic to visually separate its buildings from those of the city. This is the tower of Yale's law school. When you see it, you immediately know it's part of Yale, because the only similar structures in New Haven are other Yale buildings. Plus, you couldn't mistake this for an office building or a bank. The Collegiate Gothic style faded in the late 1930s in favor of more modern and abstract styles, but it didn't totally disappear. Yale completed 2 residence colleges in 2017, both in the Collegiate Gothic style. Next slide. On Ben Franklin Residence College, you can find this series of portraits. Who are they? Well, the key to answering this lies in the abstract relief at the center. It looks like a satellite photo you might see on Google Maps or MapQuest. Look at the building in the center. Its rounded porch may look familiar. This is an overhead view of the White House City Block in Washington, D.C. The Y within the White House identifies these as portraits of various Yale alumni who have occupied it. And going counterclockwise from the left, there's the 27th president, William Taft, the 38th president, Gerald Ford, the 41st president, George Bush Sr., the 42nd president, Bill Clinton, and the 43rd president, George Bush Jr. Next slide. This pizza peel This relief decorates the outside of Pauli Murray College's lounge and depicts the hamburger as was originally intended by its creator, New Haven's Louis Lasson of Louis' Lunch, on toast without ketchup. Next slide. This pizza peel holds 2 slices. From the arrangement of the toppings, one can tell the slices come from 2 famous New Haven pizzerias, that of Pepe's and Sally's. And personally, I like the use of the pepperoni slices as periods. Next slide. Pauli Murray College alludes to the early days of computing by referencing computer pioneer and Yale alum Grace Hopper. She coined the term computer bug when she found a moth had short-circuited her computer. Next slide. And modern computing is portrayed by this electronic tablet. Personally, I really think this is an iPad, judging by the shape of the home button at the bottom. These are just a few of the examples of what I found at these universities. My book has 300 pages and over 500 photos, so there are many, many more. Next slide. When I traveled to these campuses, I came to see that I had a certain advantage over people who lived and worked in them every day. I found that I had the newcomer's advantage of having a fresh perspective by seeing these buildings for the first time. Many people who I had met at these institutions were surprised by what I found at their own campus. To be honest, I believe this has more to do with my mindset than my powers of observation. It's very easy to become distracted and never notice the details around you, especially when your surroundings have become so familiar. By its generous use of ornament, Collegiate Gothic is an example of the many opportunities to find intriguing things that can exist all around us, and that we may overlook every day, things that, upon closer inspection, can reveal a variety of fascinating ideas and stories. What I wanted to accomplish by assembling these images is to show a few of the amazing things that you can find by merely noticing the detail around you, not just blindly accepting the way things are, but asking why things are the way they are. So look around you. You might find interesting things. Next slide. Literally coming out of the woodwork, like these old chums inside Trinity's chapel in Hartford, Connecticut. Next slide. Now remember these guys from the beginning? My sarcastic nickname for this sculpture is Pilgrim's Progress. When I first saw it, Pilgrim's Progress looked a little different. Originally, it looked like this. Next slide. This is on Sterling Memorial Library at Yale University. And in 2017, Yale was renovating Sterling. Now, Yale has had problems with political correctness in the past, so fearing controversy, the university put a blob of cement over the Puritan's rifle. This caused a controversy itself, so the whole sculpture was covered with wood. In the fall of 2019, the wood came down and Pilgrim's Progress was gone. It was replaced by this. Next slide. A grotesque depicting a tutor and a student, which is a mirror image of the original grotesque on the opposite side of the gate. Next slide. Note how the book they're holding is backwards in the new version on the right. All I can say about this is, if Marty McFly from Back to the Future has taught us anything, is that you can't change the past without ruining the present. Next slide. My book, The Grotesque 10, is available at thegrotesque10.com and on Amazon. And you can email me at mathew.duman@thegrotesque10.com. That's Matthew with one T. And that's my lecture.